Frank slumped in the cold metal chair, his wrists shackled to the table. The handcuffs bit into his skin, and every movement was a fresh assault of pain. A bitter chuckle escaped his lips as he recalled the general's furious exit. But his brief moment of grim amusement was abruptly shattered when the door swung open with a violent crash. The gust of wind that followed was not the general returning but the unmistakable presence of his nemesis, the sadistic officer. His cold eyes gleamed with malevolent delight, flanked by two henchmen who moved with grim efficiency. One soldier dragged a heavy, rusted chain across the floor, the links clattering with each step. The officer approached Frank with deliberate menace, his gaze as sharp as a blade. The soldiers took their positions. One fastened the chain to Frank's handcuffs, while the other threw the other end over a grimy, rusted pipe that ran along the ceiling. Without warning, the chain tightened, yanking Frank off the floor. His feet dangled a mere foot above the ground as he was hoisted painfully against the wall, the chain digging into his flesh. The officer's cruel laughter echoed through the room as he sauntered to the corner on Frank's left. There, a generator sat ominously, its low hum vibrating through the air. Jumper cables lay sprawled across the floor like sinister snakes. The officer flicked a switch on the generator, and a high-pitched whine filled the room. He picked up the alligator clips, his eyes alight with malicious glee. Sparks danced as he slapped the clips together, each flash a prelude to the suffering he was about to inflict. Frank's scream erupted as the officer clamped the clips onto his chest. The electrical current surged through his body, a torrent of agony that felt like 1,000 blows striking him in rapid succession. His muscles twitched and spasmed uncontrollably, his entire form racked with torment. The officer's laughter was a cold, mocking symphony as he gestured to his henchmen, who took turns administering the shocks with detached cruelty. The officer reclined in a chair, feet propped up on the table, smoking a cigarette with a smirk of dark satisfaction. The minutes dragged on, each one a grueling eternity as Frank endured the relentless shocks. Finally, the soldiers, growing bored with their cruel game, ceased their torment. The officer and his henchmen exited, their footsteps fading away. Frank was left dangling, barely conscious, his mind a fog of pain and confusion. Shadows seemed to close in, whispering promises of an eternal void. Just as Frank was on the brink of surrendering to the darkness, the distant sound of gunfire pierced through his daze. The crackle of bullets hitting the building grew louder, the once distant chaos now a palpable force shaking the walls. Another power struggle was erupting outside, for the desolate landscape scarred with the crimes of a fractured humanity brought to the brink of destruction. The gunfire continued for several minutes as Frank hung from the ceiling, wondering how long until the raging inferno of war erupting around him would spill into the room and consume his very soul. Frank could tell that whatever disturbance had occurred outside had been swiftly handled by his captors, a realization confirmed when he was once again confronted by the officer's henchmen. Two burly guards seized the chain that had been holding Frank suspended in the air and disconnected it from the wall, causing him to plummet heavily to the floor. The soldiers were quick to haul him upright, dragging him out of the room and down the hallway to a nearby jail cell. With brutal efficiency, they hurled Frank against the cell door, which swung open from the impact, and he collapsed onto the cold floor inside. The guards wasted no time, slamming the cell door shut behind him and retreating down the hallway, their footsteps fading as they left. Frank lay there, disoriented and bewildered by the sudden urgency of his return to captivity. His confusion began to clear as he braced himself for what was to come next. The door to the hallway suddenly swung open again, and two enemy soldiers appeared, dragging behind them another figure in a peculiar, though strangely familiar, uniform. The man being dragged wore the same unique uniform with unusual insignia as the stormtroopers Frank had seen killed in the basement of the police station before his imprisonment. Frank's mind raced with questions. Who were these men? As he observed from his cell, the general entered the hallway behind the soldiers and their new captive. Frank watched with growing curiosity and unease as they dragged the mysterious soldier into the very room where Frank had earlier been subjected to intense electrical shocks. The ongoing gunfight outside, which had never fully ceased, now intensified, causing the entire building to shudder with each distant explosion. The soldiers, having brought the prisoner into the room with the general, quickly returned to the hallway, leaving the general alone with the new captive. Their departure seemed ill-timed, as the escalating chaos of the battle outside made their presence in the hallway particularly precarious. The gunfire grew more intense, shaking the very foundations of the building. An explosion rocked the side of the structure, sending debris and chunks of concrete hurtling into the hallway. Frank was violently thrown against the back of his cell, his body crashing to the cold floor. The explosion was devastating for the two soldiers in the hallway. One soldier was instantly killed, a massive piece of concrete crushing him against the cell bars with a sickening crunch. The other soldier was impaled by a length of rebar, the metal, still with a chunk of concrete attached, piercing through his chest, leaving him critically wounded on the ground. In the chaos, Frank seized the opportunity. He lunged for the keys that had fallen from the dead soldier's belt, freeing himself from the cell. Grabbing the assault rifle from the impaled soldier, his focus was razor-sharp. The map, his reason for enduring this torment, was his sole priority. With adrenaline coursing through him, Frank stormed towards the room where the general had been left. He kicked the door open with a powerful thrust, the impact sending it crashing into the general and toppling him to the floor. The general lay sprawled, stunned, as Frank leveled the rifle at him. His gaze flickered to the prisoner, shackled to the table where Frank had suffered. "In here, we are all friends," Frank said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. He forced the general at gunpoint to unlock the prisoner's cuffs. The freed man quickly took control, handcuffing the general to the table. Frank tossed the rifle to the prisoner as he said, "Hold the hallway," in a stern voice. "You got it," the now freed prisoner announced as he ran around Frank and back out into the hallway. Frank removed the pistol from the general's belt and sat down on the chair across the table from him. Realization that fate had taken an unfortunate turn set in when Frank leaned forward and removed a pack of cigarettes from his oppressor's jacket pocket. The general cringed as a shot rang out from behind him. Frank's new ally had just executed the wounded soldier impaled in the hallway. Frank took a moment to light a cigarette, savoring the brief respite. The smoke curled around him, a bitter reminder of the general's presence. Frank took a deep drag, the tobacco providing a fleeting comfort amidst the chaos. With one final drag, he extinguished the cigarette with a firm stamp. The general's watch caught the light, a stark contrast to the blood now staining the table. Frank's gaze fixed on the watch, his resolve hardening. Without hesitation, he raised the pistol and fired. The shot rang out with a deafening crack, blood erupting from the general's head in a gruesome spray, a geyser of gore that gushed out onto the table in front of him. The bullet smashed against the wall behind the general's head, followed by the wet sound of brain matter slapping against the same surface. The general's body slumped forward, his life extinguished, leaving him a lifeless corpse. Frank retrieved his precious blood-stained map from the general's jacket pocket. Having stayed true to its curse, he simultaneously reclaimed his watch from the general's wrist. Emerging from the room, Frank sprinted over to the soldier who had been crushed by the falling concrete and yanked off the dead man's armored vest. The vest, equipped with several magazines and grenades, seemed to be in good condition, so Frank quickly strapped it on and grabbed the soldier's rifle from the ground. His new ally was already firing through the massive breach in the wall caused by the earlier explosion, engaging in a fierce battle with enemy soldiers both inside and around the prison. Frank crouched near the gaping hole to get a clearer view of the chaos unfolding outside. Bullets began to pour into the building through the hole as Frank and his new companion continued their return fire. The sound of rounds striking the concrete around them was deafening, akin to a torrential downpour, sending shards of rock and debris into the air. Frank's new ally glanced over at him and shouted above the din, "The name's Charlie. Thanks for the save back there." Frank, briefly acknowledging the introduction amidst the chaos, replied, "Name's Frank. No problem." However, their brief exchange was cut short by the thunderous roar of tank tracks rapidly approaching them. An armored personnel carrier came barreling towards the building at high speed, crashing into it just feet away from Frank and Charlie's position. The impact jolted the vehicle to a halt, causing debris from the collapsing building to rain down upon it. As the dust and rubble settled, soldiers disembarked from the damaged vehicle right in front of Frank and Charlie. Before Frank could even assess whether these new soldiers were allies or enemies, an anti-tank missile streaked through the air, slamming into the armored vehicle's cargo compartment. The explosion tore the vehicle open with explosive force, hurling the soldiers who had just dismounted violently into the air. The blast annihilated some of them, leaving others sprawled on the ground, grievously injured and burning amidst the wreckage. Thick, choking smoke billowed out from the destroyed armored vehicle, enveloping Frank and Charlie as they struggled to regain their bearings and make sense of the deteriorating situation around them. Frank's head throbbed from the explosion, his vision a chaotic blur. His rifle had been flung onto the ground just out of reach, lying near the enormous breach in the wall. As he scrambled to recover it, Frank peered through the gap and saw a horde of enemy soldiers charging toward them from the shattered front gate. The sheer number of attackers was daunting, and Frank felt unprepared for the onslaught. On his left, Charlie was laying down a ferocious stream of gunfire into the advancing enemy, his assault rifle barking relentlessly before he ducked back behind cover, narrowly avoiding a deadly barrage. Frank knew he needed to act fast. Remembering the grenade strapped to his vest, he yanked the pin and hurled it through the breach. The subsequent explosion was deafening, and Frank rolled away from the hole to grab his rifle. The grenade had briefly disrupted the enemy's advance, but they were already regrouping and closing in again. 3 enemy soldiers dashed toward the breach and attempted to leap through just as Charlie finished reloading. Charlie's rifle erupted in a torrent of fire, unleashing a devastating barrage that tore through the soldiers at point-blank range. The vicious onslaught ripped their bodies apart, flinging them like ragdolls into the wind. Both Frank and Charlie were momentarily stunned by the sheer carnage unfolding before them, bodies scattered and mangled in the aftermath. Frank and Charlie exchanged a grim glance, their faces etched with determination. They knew they couldn't hold out much longer against the relentless tide of enemy soldiers. "Time to get out of here," Frank said, his voice low and urgent. Charlie nodded, and together they sprinted towards the rear of the building. As they ran, Frank glanced back at the chaos behind them. He watched in awe as Charlie gunned down multiple adversaries in pursuit, his movements swift and calculated. The enemy soldiers faltered, caught off guard by Charlie's sudden assault as he covered their escape. It was clear to Frank that Charlie was a veteran soldier, a man whose soul had been forged in the fires of conflict. His every movement screamed of experience and expertise, a testament to the countless hours he had spent honing his craft in the crucible of war. His actions were a masterful performance of skill and precision that spoke of countless battles. Charlie was more than just a skilled fighter. He was a brother in arms, a fellow soldier who had stepped into the fray without hesitation to protect their shared cause, survival. Reaching the back door, Frank cautiously peered outside, his heart pounding in his chest. The alleyway was deserted, but he could hear the chaotic sounds of gunfire and explosions echoing through the prison. "Let's move," Charlie yelled, pushing Frank towards the exit. As they burst out into the alley, Frank's eyes scanned the desolate landscape, his gaze settling on a battered motorcycle leaning against the wall, its engine still running. Without hesitation, he leapt onto the bike, the roar of the engine vibrating through his body as he revved it to life. Charlie climbed on behind him, his strong grip on Frank's vest as they sped down the alley, dodging craters and debris with a precision that spoke of countless battles fought and won. Quickly reaching the end of the alley, Frank hit the throttle, the motorcycle surging forward like a living beast, its tires screeching against the cracked pavement. Bullets rapidly snapped in the air around them, a hailstorm of gunfire that seemed to come from every direction. Enemy soldiers poured out of the gatehouse, their weapons blazing as they attempted to halt their escape. Charlie's rifle barked in response, a fury of gunfire that tore through the enemy ranks, sending them reeling in chaos. Frank gripped the handlebars tightly as they skimmed over potholes and craters, the bike suspension groaning under the strain. As they flew by the gatehouse, Frank caught a glimpse of his nemesis, the officer, shooting at them from the window. His eyes met Frank's for a split second, a cold, calculating look that spoke of a man who had lost all sense of humanity. Frank and Charlie emerged through the prison gate and back into the destroyed landscape, the motorcycle surging forward like a wild animal released from its cage. Bullets chased them down the road like dark specters, relentless in their pursuit of their souls. The projectiles cracked in the wind around them, a cacophony of gunfire that seemed to echo the very fabric of war. It was as if the gods of war themselves were trying to drag them back into the heart of darkness, to snuff out the last vestiges of hope and light that remained within them. The bullets seemed to close in around them, a maelstrom of death and destruction that threatened to consume them at any moment. The road stretched out into a winding path that led through the shattered remnants of a once great city, towards the distant horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of glory. As they raced towards their unknown fate, Frank and Charlie knew that they were not just escaping the clutches of their enemies, but also the crushing weight of their pasts. Just as the eruption of gunfire began to recede into the distance, a chilling, unmistakable sound cut through the air like a knife. A drone, its engine humming with a menacing buzz, was hot on their trail, rapidly closing in. Frank's heart raced as the drone's presence sent shivers down his spine. The motorcycle, with its heavy tires kicking up a cloud of dust, left an obvious trail that the drone's advanced sensors would have little trouble following. Charlie, sensing the urgency of their situation, gripped Frank's vest tightly as he urged the motorcycle forward. The bike's engine roared in response, the two of them speeding through the desolate landscape like a pair of desperados on the run. The drone's buzz grew louder, the sound echoing through the shattered cityscape, a relentless pursuit that seemed to mock their every attempt at escape. Frank glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the sky for any sign of the drone. The enemy drone was a fearsome predator. Its explosive payload and advanced optics made it a formidable opponent. With a grim determination, Frank focused on the road ahead, his grip on the handlebars tightening as he steered the motorcycle through the ruins. The drone's buzz grew closer, its presence a constant reminder of the danger that pursued them. As they raced through the city, Frank caught glimpses of the devastation that surrounded them. Buildings lay in ruins, their once grand facades now shattered and broken. The streets were empty, the only signs of life the distant rumble of gunfire and the relentless hum of the drone. Frank and Charlie were not just fleeing from their enemies. They were also running from the ghosts of their pasts. The horrors they had faced all weighed heavily on their minds. But they pushed on, driven by a fierce determination to survive, to find a way out of the darkness and into the light. Frank and Charlie knew they had to move with ruthless speed, utilizing every maneuver at their disposal to outsmart their relentless pursuer. The motorcycle roared through the wreckage-strewn streets, skidding and swerving with fierce urgency. The tires screamed as they navigated through a landscape of crumbling buildings and scattered debris. Once a bustling artery, the street had become a desolate graveyard of charred vehicles and deep craters, littered with the fractured remains of collapsed structures. "Get ready!" Frank shouted, his voice barely piercing the roar of the engine. With a sudden jerk, he veered the motorcycle off the road and into a narrow trench. The bike skidded sideways before Frank leapt off, rolling across the gritty ground and taking cover in a nearby crater. Charlie followed suit, jumping from the bike and crashing into the crater beside him. Frank threw the motorcycle aside and dove into the trench. The two men barely had a moment to steady themselves before they saw the small, menacing kamikaze drone streaking towards them with a high-pitched whine. The drone, no bigger than a suitcase but armed with deadly intent, bore down on them with a relentless hum. They raised their rifles, and the air was filled with sharp, staccato bursts of gunfire. Their bullets shredded one of the drone's tiny wings, sending it spiraling wildly. With a frantic buzz, the crippled drone veered off course and smashed into a nearby building. The impact was a cataclysmic burst of violence. The tiny kamikaze drone slammed into the building's facade with a thunderous explosion, its metallic frame disintegrating in a fiery ball. A shower of debris erupted into the air, cascading down in a chaotic rain of jagged fragments and burning splinters. Frank and Charlie ducked low, their bodies pressed into the gritty earth as the wreckage fell around them, a barrage of lethal shrapnel narrowly missing their heads. As the dust began to settle, reality hit Frank with crushing clarity. Amidst the settling haze and the acrid smell of smoke, he glimpsed the smoldering remains of their motorcycle, twisted and burning in the trench nearby. The sight was a stark reminder of their razor-thin escape. Frank wondered if the lords of the Shadow Realm, those dark entities that haunted his thoughts, would ever grant him respite, or if he was condemned to an unending torment, forever pursued by shadows and trapped in an eternal cycle of dread and escape. The grim reality of his predicament pressed down on him. Though Frank and Charlie have managed to slip free from their captor's grasp, they remain ensnared in the relentless clutches of the war. The conflict's shadow looms large, casting a long, unforgiving reach over their lives, ensuring that their escape is only a temporary reprieve from the chaos that continues to consume everything around them.